The Secret Teachings of All Ages by ManlyPHall. Part 26, The Apocalypse, Islam and American Indian Symbolism. Enjoy the listening. The presence of the Temple of Diana at Ephesus marked that city as sacred to the mystery religion, for the 7 wonders of the ancient world were erected to indicate the repositories of recondite knowledge. Of Ephesus, H.P. Blavatsky writes, "It was a focus of the universal, secret doctrines. The weird laboratory whence, fashioned in elegant Grecian phraseology, sprang the quintessence of Buddhistic, Zoroastrian, and Chaldean philosophy. Artemis, the gigantic concrete symbol of theosophico-pantheistic abstractions, the great mother multimamma, androgyne and patroness of the Ephesian writings, was conquered by Paul. But although the zealous converts of the apostles pretended to burn all their books on curious arts, enough of these remained for them to study when their first zeal had cooled off. Being a great center of pagan learning, Ephesus has been the locale for many early Christian myths. The assertion has been made that it was the last domicile of the Virgin Mary. Also that the tomb of St. John the Divine was located there. According to legend, St. John did not depart from this life in the usual manner, but selecting his vault, entered it while still alive, and closing the entrance behind him, vanished forever from mortal sight. A rumor was current in ancient Ephesus that St. John would sleep in his tomb until the return of the Savior, and that when the apostle turned over on his sepulchral couch, the earth above moved like the coverlets of a bed. Subjected to more criticism than any other book now incorporated in the New Testament, the Apocalypse, popularly accredited to St. John the Divine, is by far the most important but least understood of the Gnostic Christian writings. Though Justin Martyr declared the book of Revelation to have been written by John, one of Christ's apostles, its authorship was disputed as early as the 2nd century after Christ. In the 3rd century, these contentions became acute, and even Dionysius of Alexandria and Eusebius attacked the Johannine theory, declaring that both the book of Revelation and the Gospel according to St. John were written by one Cerinthus, who borrowed the name of the great apostle the better to foist his own doctrines upon the Christians. Later Jerome questioned the authorship of the Apocalypse, and during the Reformation his objections were revived by Luther and Erasmus. The once generally accepted notion that the book of Revelation was the actual record of a mystical experience, occurring to St. John while that seer was in exile in the Isle of Patmos, is now regarded with disfavor by more critical scholars. Other explanations have therefore been advanced to account for the symbolism permeating the volume and the original motive for its writing. The more reasonable of these theories may be summed up as follows. First, upon the weight of evidence furnished by its own contents, the Book of Revelation may well be pronounced a pagan writing, one of the sacred books of the Eleusinian or Phrygian mysteries. As a corollary, the real author of a work setting forth the profundities of Egyptian and Greek mysticism must have been an initiate himself, and consequently obligated to write only in the symbolic language of the mysteries. Second, it is possible that the Book of Revelation was written to reconcile the seeming discrepancies between the early Christian and pagan religious philosophies. When the zealots of the primitive Christian church sought to Christianize pagandom, the pagan initiates retorted with a powerful effort to paganize Christianity. The Christians failed, but the pagans succeeded. With the decline of paganism, the initiated pagan hierophants transferred their base of operations to the new vehicle of primitive Christianity, adopting the symbols of the new cult to conceal those eternal verities which are ever the priceless possession of the wise. The Apocalypse shows clearly the resultant fusion of pagan and Christian symbolism, and thus bears irrefutable evidence of the activities of these initiated minds operating through early Christianity. Third, the theory has been advanced that the Book of Revelation represents the attempt made by the unscrupulous members of a certain religious order to undermine the Christian mysteries by satirizing their philosophy. This nefarious end they hope to attain by showing the new faith to be merely a restatement of the ancient pagan doctrines, by heaping ridicule upon Christianity, and by using its own symbols toward its disparagement. For example, the star which fell to earth could be construed to mean the Star of Bethlehem, and the bitterness of that star, called wormwood and which poisoned mankind, could signify the false teachings of the Christian Church. While the last theory has gained a certain measure of popularity, the profundity of the apocalypse leads the discerning reader to the inevitable conclusion that this is the least plausible of the three hypotheses. To those able to pierce the veil of its symbolism, the inspired source of the document requires no further corroborative evidence. In the final analysis, true philosophy can be limited by neither creed nor faction. In fact, it is incompatible with every artificial limitation of human thought. The question of the pagan or Christian origin of the Book of Revelation is, consequently, of little importance. The intrinsic value of the book lies in its magnificent epitome of the universal mystery, an observation which led St. Jerome to declare that it is susceptible of 7 entirely different interpretations. Untrained in the reaches of ancient thought, the modern theologian cannot possibly cope with the complexities of the apocalypse, for to him this mystic writing is but a phantasmagoria, the divine inspiration of which he is sorely tempted to question. In the limited space here available, it is possible to sketch, but briefly, a few of the salient features of the vision of the seer of Patmos. A careful consideration of the various pagan mysteries will assist materially also in filling the inevitable gaps in this abridgment. In the opening chapter of the Apocalypse, St. John describes the Alpha and Omega who stood in the midst of the 7 golden candlesticks. Surrounded by his flaming planetary regents, this sublime one thus epitomizes in one impressive and mysterious figure the entire sweep of humanity's evolutionary growth, past, present, and future. The first stages of man's earthly development, writes Dr. Rudolf Steiner, ran their course at a period when the earth was still fiery, and the first human incarnations were formed out of the element of fire. At the end of his earthly career, man will himself radiate his inner being outwards creatively by the force of the element of fire. This continuous development from the beginning to the end of the earth reveals itself to the seer, when he sees on the astral plane the archetype of evolving man. The beginning of earthly evolution stands forth in the fiery feet, its end in the fiery countenance, and the complete power of the creative word, to be finally one, is seen in the fiery source coming out of the mouth. James Morgan Price traces the relationship of the various parts of the Alpha and Omega to the 7 sacred planets of the ancients. To quote, "The Logos figure described is a composite picture of the 7 sacred planets. He has the snowy white hair of Kronos, Father Time, the blazing eyes of wide-seeing Zeus, the sword of Ares, the shining face of Helios, and the chiton and girdle of Aphrodite. His feet are of Mercury, the metal sacred to Hermes, and his voice is like the murmur of the ocean's waves, the many waters," alluding to Selene, the moon goddess of the 4 seasons and of the waters. The 7 stars carried by this immense being in his right hand are the governors of the world. The flaming sword issuing from his mouth is the creative fiat, or word of power, by which the illusion of material permanence is slain. Here also is represented, in all his symbolic splendor, the Hierophant of the Phrygian mysteries, his various insignia emblematic of his divine attributes. 7 priests bearing lamps are his attendants, and the stars carried in his hand are the 7 schools of the mysteries whose power he administers. As one born again out of spiritual darkness into perfect wisdom, this Archimagus is made to say, "I am he that lived and was dead, and behold, I am alive forevermore, amen, and have the keys of hell and of death." In the 2nd and 3rd chapters, St. John delivers to the 7 churches which are in Asia the injunctions received by him from the Alpha and Omega. The churches are here analogous to the rungs of a Mithraic ladder, and John, being in the Spirit, ascended through the orbits of the 7 sacred planets until he reached the inner surface of the Empyrean. After the soul of the prophet, writes the anonymous author of mankind, their origin and destiny, in his ecstatic state has passed in its rapid flight through the 7 spheres, from the sphere of the moon to that of Saturn, or from the planet which corresponds to Cancer, the gate of men, to that of Capricorn, which is the gate of the gods. A new gate opens to him in the highest heaven, and in the zodiac beneath which the 7 planets revolve. In a word, in the firmament, or that which the ancients called crystallinum primum, or the crystal heaven. When related to the Eastern system of metaphysics, these churches represent the chakras, or nerve ganglia, along the human spine, the door in heaven being the Brahmarandra, or point in the crown of the skull, Golgotha, through which the spinal spirit fire passes to liberation. The Church of Ephesus corresponds to the Muladhara, or sacral ganglion, and the other churches to the higher ganglia according to the order given in Revelation. Dr. Steiner discovers a relationship between the 7 churches and the divisions of the Aryan race. Thus, the Church of Ephesus stands for the Arch-Indian branch, the Church of Smyrna, the Arch-Persians, the Church of Pergamos, the Chaldean-Egyptian Semitic, the Church of Thyatira, the Grecian-Latin-Roman, the Church of Sardis, the Teuton Anglo-Saxon, the Church of Philadelphia, the Slavic, and the Church of Laodicea, the Manichaean. The 7 churches also signify the Greek vowels, of which Alpha and Omega are the first and the last. A difference of opinion exists as to the order in which the 7 planets should be related to the churches. Some proceed from the hypothesis that Saturn represents the Church of Ephesus. But from the fact that this city was sacred to the moon goddess, and also that the sphere of the moon is the first above that of the earth, the planets obviously should ascend in their ancient order from the moon to Saturn. From Saturn, the soul would naturally ascend through the door in the Empyrean. In the 4th and 5th chapters, St. John describes the throne of God upon which sat the Holy One, which was and is to come. About the throne were 24 lesser seats upon which sat 24 elders arrayed in white garments and wearing crowns of gold. And out of the throne proceeded lightnings and thunderings and voices, and there were 7 lamps of fire burning before the throne, which are the 7 spirits of God. He who sat upon the throne held in his right hand a book sealed with 7 seals, which no man in heaven or earth had been found worthy to open. Then appeared a lamb, Aries, the first and chief of the zodiacal signs, which had been slain, having 7 horns, rays, and 7 eyes, lights. The Lamb took the book from the right hand of him that sat upon the throne and the 4 beasts, and all the elders fell down and worshipped God and the Lamb. During the early centuries of the Christian Church, the Lamb was universally recognized as the symbol of Christ, and not until after the 5th Synod of Constantinople, the Quinticistic Synod, AD 692, was the figure of the crucified man substituted for that of Agnus Dei. As shrewdly noted by one writer on the subject, the use of a lamb is indicative of the Persian origin of Christianity, for the Persians were the only people to symbolize the first sign of the zodiac by a lamb. Because a lamb was the sin offering of the ancient pagans, the early mystic Christians considered this animal as an appropriate emblem of Christ, whom they regarded as the sin offering of the world. The Greeks and the Egyptians highly venerated the lamb or ram, often placing its horns upon the foreheads of their gods. The Scandinavian god Thor carried a hammer made from a pair of ram's horns. The lamb is used in preference to the ram, apparently because of its purity and gentleness. Also, since the Creator himself was symbolized by Aries, his son would consequently be the little ram or lamb. The lambskin apron worn by the Freemasons over that part of the body symbolized by Typhon or Judas represents that purification of the generative processes which is a prerequisite to true spirituality. In this allegory, the lamb signifies the purified candidate, its 7 horns representing the divisions of illuminated reason, and its 7 eyes the chakras, or perfected sense perceptions. The 6th to 11th chapters inclusive are devoted to an account of the opening of the 7 seals on the book held by the Lamb. When the first seal was broken, there rode forth a man on a white horse wearing a crown and holding in his hand a bow. When the second seal was broken, there rode forth a man upon a red horse, and in his hand was a great sword. When the third seal was broken, there rode forth a man upon a black horse, and with a pair of balances in his hand. And when the 4th seal was broken, there rode forth Death upon a pale horse, and hell followed after him. The 4 horsemen of the Apocalypse may be interpreted to signify the 4 main divisions of human life. Birth is represented by the rider on the white horse, who comes forth conquering and to conquer. The impetuosity of youth by the rider on the red horse, who took peace from the earth. Maturity by the rider on the black horse, who weighs all things in the scales of reason. And death by the rider on the pale horse, who is given power over a 4th part of the earth. In the Eastern philosophy, these horsemen signify the 4 yugas, or ages, of the world which, riding forth at their appointed times, become for a certain span the rulers of creation. Commenting on the 24th allocution of Chrysostom, in the origin of all religious worship, Dupuy notes that each of the 4 elements was represented by a horse bearing the name of the god, who is set over the element. The first horse, signifying the fire ether, was called Jupiter and occupied the highest place in the order of the elements. This horse was winged, very fleet, and describing the largest circle encompassed all the others. It shone with the purest light, and on its body were the images of the sun, the moon, the stars, and all the bodies in the ethereal regions. The second horse, signifying the element of air, was Juno. It was inferior to the horse of Jupiter and described a smaller circle. Its color was black, but that part exposed to the sun became luminous, thus signifying the diurnal and nocturnal conditions of air. The third horse, symbolizing the element of water, was sacred to Neptune. It was of heavy gait and described a very small circle. The fourth horse, signifying the static element of earth, described as immovable and champing its bit, was the steed of Vesta. Despite their differences in temperature, these four horses lived harmoniously together, which is in accord with the principles of the philosophers, who declared the world to be preserved by the concord and harmony of its elements. In time, however, the racing horse of Jupiter burned the mane of the horse of Earth. The thundering steed of Neptune also became covered with sweat, which overflowed the immovable horse of Vesta and resulted in the deluge of Deucalion. At last, the fiery horse of Jupiter will consume the rest, when the three inferior elements, purified by reabsorption in the fiery ether, will come forth renewed, constituting a new heaven and a new earth. When the fifth seal was opened, St. John beheld those who had died for the word of God. When the sixth seal was broken, there was a great earthquake, the sun being darkened and the moon becoming like blood. The angels of the winds came forth, and also another angel, who sealed upon their foreheads 144,000 of the children of Israel, that they should be preserved against the awful day of tribulation. By adding the digits together, according to the Pythagorean system of numerical philosophy, the number 144,000 is reduced to 9, the mystic symbol of man and also the number of initiation. For he who passes through the 9 degrees of the mysteries receives the sign of the cross as emblematic of his regeneration and liberation from the bondage of his own infernal, or inferior, nature. The addition of the 3 ciphers to the original sacred number 144 indicates the elevation of the mystery to the 3rd sphere. When the 7th seal was broken, there was silence for the space of half an hour. Then came forth 7 angels, and to each was given a trumpet. When the 7 angels sounded their trumpets, intoned the 7-lettered name of the Logos, great catastrophes ensued. A star, which was called Wormhood, fell from heaven, thereby signifying that the secret doctrine of the ancients had been given to men who had profaned it, and caused the wisdom of God to become a destructive agency. And another star, symbolizing the false light of human reason as distinguished from the divine reason of the initiate, fell from heaven, and to it, materialistic reason, was given the key to the bottomless pit, nature, which it opened, causing all manner of evil creatures to issue forth. And there came also a mighty angel who was clothed in a cloud, whose face was as the sun and his feet and legs as pillars of fire, and one foot was upon the waters and the other upon the land, the Hermetic Anthropos. This celestial being gave St. John a little book, bidding him eat it, which the seer did. The book is representative of the secret doctrine, that spiritual food which is the nourishment of the spirit. And St. John, being in the spirit, ate his fill of the wisdom of God, and the hunger of his soul was appeased. The 12th chapter treats of a great wonder appearing in the heavens, a woman clothed with the sun, the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. This woman represents the constellation of Virgo, and also the Egyptian Isis, who, about to be delivered of her son Horus, is attacked by Typhon, the latter attempting to destroy the child, predestined by the gods to slay the spirit of evil. The war in heaven relates to the destruction of the planet Ragnarok and to the fall of the angels. The Virgin can be interpreted to signify the secret doctrine itself, and her son the initiate born out of the womb of the mysteries. The spirit of evil thus personified in the great dragon attempted to control mankind by destroying the mother of those illumined souls who have labored unceasingly for the salvation of the world. Wings were given to the mysteries, the Virgin, and they flew into the wilderness. And the evil dragon tried to destroy them with a flood of false doctrine, but the earth, oblivion, swallowed up the false doctrines, and the mysteries endured. The 13th chapter describes a great beast which rose out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns. Faber sees in this amphibious monster the Demiurgus, or creator of the world, rising out of the ocean of chaos. While most interpreters of the apocalypse consider the various beasts described therein as typical of evil agencies, this viewpoint is the inevitable result of unfamiliarity with the ancient doctrines from which the symbolism of the book is derived. Astronomically, the great monster rising out of the sea is the constellation of Cetus, the whale. Because religious ascetics looked upon the universe itself as an evil and ensnaring fabrication, they also came to regard its very creator as a weaver of delusions. Thus the great sea monster, the world and its maker, the demiurgus, whose strength is derived from the dragon of cosmic power, came to be personified as a beast of horror and destruction, seeking to swallow up the immortal part of human nature. The 7 heads of the monster represent the 7 stars, spirits, composing the constellation of the Great Dipper, called by the Hindus rishis or cosmic creative spirits. The 10 horns Faber relates to the 10 primordial patriarchs. These may also denote the ancient zodiac of 10 signs. The number of the beast, 666, is an interesting example of the use of Qabbalism in the New Testament and among early Christian mystics. In the following table, Kircher shows that the names of Antichrist as given by Irenaeus all have 666 as their numerical equivalent. The 14th chapter opens with the Lamb standing on Mount Zion, the eastern horizon. About him gathered the 144,000 with the name of God written in their foreheads. An angel thereupon announces the fall of Babylon, the city of confusion or worldliness. Those perish who do not overcome worldliness and enter into the realization that spirit, and not matter, is enduring. For, having no interests other than those which are material, they are swept to destruction with the material world. And St. John beheld one like unto the Son of Man, Perseus, riding upon a cloud, the substances of the invisible world, and bearing in his hand a sharp sickle, and with the sickle the Shining One reaped the earth. This is a symbol of the initiator releasing into the sphere of reality the higher natures of those who, symbolized by ripened grain, have reached the point of liberation. And there came another angel, Boots, Death, also with a sickle, Karma, who reaped the vines of the earth, those who have lived by the false light, and cast them into the winepress of the wrath of God, the purgatorial spheres. The 15th to 18th chapters inclusive contain an account of 7 angels, the Pleiades, who pour their vials upon the earth. The contents of their vials, the loosened energy of the cosmic bull, are called the 7 last plagues. Here also is introduced a symbolic figure, termed the Harlot of Babylon, which is described as a woman seated upon a scarlet-colored beast having 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet and bedecked with gold, precious stones, and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations. This figure may be an effort, probably interpolated, to vilify Cybele or Artemis, the great mother goddess of antiquity. Because the pagans venerated the Mater Diorum through symbols appropriate to the feminine generative principle, they were accused by the early Christians of worshipping a courtesan. As nearly all the ancient mysteries included a test of the neophyte's moral character, the temptress, the animal soul, is here portrayed as a pagan goddess. In the 19th and 20th chapters is set forth the preparation of that mystical sacrament called the marriage of the Lamb. The bride is the soul of the neophyte, which attains conscious immortality by uniting itself to its own spiritual source. The heavens opened once more, and St. John saw a white horse, and the rider, the illumined mind, which sat upon it, was called Faithful and True. Out of his mouth issued a sharp sword, and the armies of heaven followed after him. Upon the plains of heaven was fought the mystic Armageddon, the last great war between light and darkness. The forces of evil under the Persian Ahriman battled against the forces of good under Ahura Mazda. Evil was vanquished, and the beast and the false prophet cast into a lake of fiery brimstone. Satan was bound for 1,000 years. Then followed the last judgment. The books were opened, including the book of life. The dead were judged according to their works, and those whose names were not in the book of life were cast into a sea of fire. To the neophyte, Armageddon represents the last struggle between the flesh and the spirit, when, finally overcoming the world, the illumined soul rises to union with its spiritual self. The judgment signifies the weighing of the soul and was borrowed from the mysteries of Osiris. The rising of the dead from their graves and from the sea of illusion represents the consummation of the process of human regeneration. The The sea of fire into which those are cast who fail in the ordeal of initiation signifies the fiery sphere of the animal world. In the 21st and 22nd chapters are pictured the new heaven and the new earth to be established at the close of Ahriman's reign. St. John, carried in the spirit to a great and high mountain, the brain, beheld the New Jerusalem descending as a bride adorned for her husband. The holy city represents the regenerated and perfected world, the true ashlar of the Mason, for the city was a perfect cube, it being written, "The length and the breadth and the height of it are equal." The foundation of the holy city consisted of 144 stones in 12 rows, from which it is evident that the New Jerusalem represents the microcosm, patterned after the greater universe in which it stands. The 12 gates of this symbolic dodecahedron are the signs of the zodiac, through which the celestial impulses descend into the inferior world. The jewels are the precious stones of the zodiacal signs, and the transparent golden streets are the streams of spiritual light along which the initiate passes on his path towards the sun. There is no material temple in that city, for God and the Lamb are the temple. And there is neither sun nor moon, for God and the Lamb are the light. The glorified and spiritualized initiate is here depicted as a city. This city will ultimately be united with the Spirit of God and absorbed into the divine effulgency. And St. John beheld a river, the water of life, which proceeded out of the throne of the Lamb. The river represents the stream pouring from the first Logos, which is the life of all things and the active cause of all creation. There also was the tree of life, the Spirit bearing 12 manner of fruit, whose leaves were for the healing of the nations. By the tree is also represented the year, which every month yields some good for the maintenance of existing creatures. Jesus then tells St. John that he is the root and the offspring of David and the bright and morning star, Venus. St. John concludes with the words, "The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you all. Amen." Representative of the attitude of Christendom toward Islam, till recent years at least, is Alexander Ross's postscript to the anglicized version, published in 1649, of Sieur du Rier's French translation of the Quran. The author of the postscript directs the following invective against Mohammed and the Quran. "Good reader, the great Arabian impostor now at last after 1,000 years, is by the way of France arrived in England, and his Alcoran or gallimaufry of errors, a brat as deformed as the parent, and as full of heresies as his scald head was of scurvy, hath learned to speak English. If you will take a brief view of the Alcoran, you shall find it a hodgepodge made up of these 4 ingredients. 1. Of contradictions. 2. Of blasphemy. 3. Of ridiculous fables. 4. Of lies. The accusation of blasphemy is emphasized against Mohammed because he affirmed that God, being unmarried, was incapable of having a son. The fallacious argument, however, is apparent from the Prophet's own views of the nature of God as contained in the 2nd surah of the Quran. To Allah God belongeth the east and the west. Therefore, whithersoever ye turn yourselves to pray, there is the face of Allah. For Allah is omnipresent and omniscient. They say, Allah hath begotten children, Allah forbid. To him belongeth whatever is in heaven and on earth. All is possessed by him, the creator of heaven and earth. And when he decreeth a thing, he only saith unto it, Be, and it is. In other words, the God of Islam has but to desire, and the object of that desire at once comes into being, whereas the God of Alexander Ross must proceed in accord with the laws of human generation. Mohammed, prophet of Islam, the desired of all nations, was born in Mecca, AD 570, and died in Medina, AD 632, or in the 11th year after the Hejira. Washington Irving thus describes the signs and wonders accompanying the birth of the prophet. His mother suffered none of the pangs of travail. At the moment of his coming into the world, a celestial light illumined the surrounding country, and the newborn child, raising his eyes to heaven, exclaimed, God is great. There is no God but God, and I am his prophet. Heaven and earth, we are assured, were agitated at his advent. The lake Sawa shrank back to its secret springs, leaving its borders dry, while the Tigris, bursting its bounds, overflowed the neighboring lands. The palace of Khosrau, the king of Persia, shook on its foundations, and several of its towers were toppled to the earth. In the same eventful night, the sacred fire of Zoroaster, which, guarded by the Magi, had burned without interruption for upward of 1,000 years, was suddenly extinguished, and all the idols in the world fell down. While the prophet was still but a toddling babe, the angel Gabriel with 70 wings came to him, and cutting open the child, withdrew the heart. This Gabriel cleansed of the black drop of original sin, which is in every human heart, because of the perfidy of Adam, and then returned the organ to its proper place in the prophet's body. In his youth, Mohammed traveled with the Meccan caravans, on one occasion acted as armor-bearer for his uncle, and spent a considerable time among the Bedouins, from whom he learned many of the religious and philosophically traditions of ancient Arabia. While traveling with his uncle, Abu Talib, Mohammed contacted the Nestorian Christians, having encamped on a certain night near one of their monasteries. Here, the young prophet-to-be secured much of his information concerning the origin and doctrines of the Christian faith. With the passing years, Mohammed attained marked success in business, and when about 26 years old married one of his employers, a wealthy widow nearly 15 years his senior. The widow, Khadija by name, was apparently somewhat mercenary, for, finding her young business manager most efficient, she resolved to retain him in that capacity for life. Khadija was a woman of exceptional mentality, and to her integrity and devotion must be ascribed the early success of the Islamic cause. By his marriage, Mohammed was elevated from a position of comparative poverty to one of great wealth and power, and so exemplary was his conduct that he became known throughout Mecca as the faithful and true. Mohammed would have lived and died an honored and respected Meccan had he not unhesitatingly sacrificed both his wealth and social position in the service of the God, whose voice he heard while meditating in the cavern on Mount Hira in the month of Ramadan. Year after year, Mohammed climbed the rocky and desolate slopes of Mount Hira, since called Jebel Nur, the mountain of light, and here in his loneliness cried out to God to reveal anew the pure religion of Adam, that spiritual doctrine lost to mankind through the dissensions of religious factions. Khadija, solicitous over her husband's ascetic practices which were impairing his physical health, sometimes accompanied him in his weary vigil, and with womanly intuition sensed the travail of his soul. At last one night in his 40th year, as he lay upon the floor of the cavern, enveloped in his cloak, a great light burst upon him. Overcome with a sense of perfect peace and understanding in the blessedness of the celestial presence, he lost consciousness. When he came to himself again, the angel Gabriel stood before him, exhibiting a silken shawl with mysterious characters traced upon it. From these characters, Mohammed gained the basic doctrines later embodied in the Quran. Then Gabriel spoke in a clear and wonderful voice, declaring Mohammed to be the prophet of the living God. In awe and trembling, Mohammed hastened to Khadija, fearing the vision to have been inspired by the same evil spirits who served the pagan magicians so greatly despised by him. Khadija assured him that his own virtuous life would be his protection and that he need fear no evil. Thus reassured, the prophet awaited further visitations from Gabriel. When these did not come, however, such a despair filled his soul that he attempted self-destruction, only to be stopped in the very act of casting himself over a cliff by the sudden reappearance of Gabriel, who again assured the prophet that the revelations needed by his people would be given to him as necessity arose. Possibly as a result of his lonely periods of meditation, Mohammed seemingly was subject to ecstatic swoons. On the occasions when the various surahs of the Quran were dictated, he is said to have fallen unconscious, and, regardless of the chill of the surrounding air, to have been covered with beads of perspiration. Often these attacks came without warning. At other times, he would sit wrapped in a blanket to prevent a chill from the copious perspiration, and while apparently unconscious, would dictate the various passages which a small circle of trusted friends would either commit to memory or reduce to writing. On one occasion in later life, when Abu Bakr referred to the gray hairs in his beard, Mohammed, lifting the end of his beard and looking at it, declared its whiteness to be due to the physical agony attendant upon his periods of inspiration. If the writings attributed to Mohammed be considered as merely the hallucinations of an epileptic, and for that reason discounted, his Christian detractors should beware lest with the doctrines of the prophet they also undermine the very teachings which they themselves affirm. For many of the disciples, apostles, and saints of the early church are known to have been subject to nervous disorders. Mohammed's first convert was his own wife, Khadija, who was followed by other members of his immediate family, a circumstance which moved Sir William Muir to note. It is strongly corroborative of Mohammed's sincerity that the earliest converts to Islam were not only of upright character, but his own bosom friends and people of his household. who, intimately acquainted with his private life, could not fail otherwise to have detected those discrepancies which ever more or less exist between the professions of the hypocritical deceiver abroad and his actions at home. Among the first to accept the faith of Islam was Abu Bakr, who became Mohammed's closest and most faithful friend, in fact his alter ego. Abu Bakr, a man of brilliant attainments, contributed materially to the success of the Prophet's enterprise, and in accord with the express wish of the Prophet, became the leader of the faithful after Mohammed's death. Aisha, the daughter of Abu Bakr, later became the wife of Mohammed, thus still further cementing the bond of fraternity between the two men. Quietly, but industriously, Mohammed promulgated his doctrines among a small circle of powerful friends. When the enthusiasm of his followers finally forced his hand and he publicly announced his mission, he was already the leader of a strong and well-organized faction. Fearing Mohammed's growing prestige, the people of Mecca, waiving the time-honored tradition that blood could not be spilt within the holy city, decided to exterminate Islam by assassinating the Prophet. All the different groups combined in this undertaking so that the guilt for the crime might thereby be more evenly distributed. Discovering the danger in time, Mohammed left his friend Ali in his bed and fled with Abu Bakr from the city, and after adroitly eluding the Meccans, joined the main body of his followers that had preceded him to Yathrib, afterwards called Medina. Upon this incident, called the Hijra, or flight, is based the Islamic chronological system. Dating from the Hijra, the power of the Prophet steadily grew until in the 8th year, Mohammed entered Mecca after practically a bloodless victory and established it as the spiritual center of his faith. Planting his standard to the north of Mecca, he rode into the city, and after circling 7 times the sacred Kaaba, ordered the 360 images within its precincts to be hewn down. He then entered the Kaaba itself, cleansed it of its idolatrous associations, and rededicated the structure to Allah, the monotheistic God of Islam. Mohammed next granted amnesty to all his enemies for their attempts to destroy him. Under his protection, Mecca increased in power and glory, becoming the focal point of a great annual pilgrimage, which even to this day winds across the desert in the months of pilgrimage and numbers over 70,000 in its train. In the 10th year after the Hijra, Mohammed led the valedictory pilgrimage, and for the last time rode at the head of the faithful along the sacred way leading to Mecca and the Black Stone. As the premonition of death was strong upon him, he desired this pilgrimage to be the perfect model for all the thousands that would follow. Conscious that life was waning away within him, writes Washington Irving, Mahomet, during this last sojourn in the sacred city of his faith, sought to engrave his doctrines deeply in the minds and hearts of his followers. For this purpose, he preached frequently in the Kaaba from the pulpit, or in the open air from the back of his camel. "Listen to my words," would he say, "for I know not whether, after this year, we shall ever meet here again. Oh, my hearers, I am but a man like yourselves. The angel of death may at any time appear, and I must obey his summons." While thus preaching, the very heavens are said to have opened, and the voice of God spoke, saying, "This day I have perfected your religion, and accomplished in you my grace." When these words were uttered, the multitude fell down in adoration, and even Mohammed's camel knelt. Having completed the valedictory pilgrimage, Mohammed returned to Medina. In the 7th year after the Hijra, AH 7, an attempt was made at Khaybar to poison the Prophet. As Mohammed took the first mouthful of the poisoned food, the evil design was revealed to him either by the taste of the meat or, as the faithful believe, by divine intercession. He had already swallowed a small portion of the food, however, and for the remainder of his life he suffered almost constantly from the effects of the poison. In AH 11, when his final illness came upon him, Mohammed insisted that the subtle effects of the poison were the indirect cause of his approaching end. It is related that during his last sickness, he rose one night and visited a burial ground on the outskirts of Medina, evidently believing that he, too, would soon be numbered with the dead. At this time, he told an attendant that the choice had been offered him of continuing his physical life or going to his Lord, and that he had chosen to meet his Maker. Mohammed suffered greatly with his head and side and also from fever, but on June 8 seemed convalescent. He joined his followers in prayer, and seating himself in the courtyard, delivered a lecture to the faithful in a clear and powerful voice. Apparently he overtaxed his strength, for it was necessary to assist him into the house of Aisha, which opened into the court of the mosque. Here, upon a tough pallet laid on the bare floor, the Prophet of Islam spent his last 2 hours on earth. When she saw that her aged husband was suffering intense pain, Aisha, then but a girl of 20, lifting the gray head of the man she had known from infancy and who must have seemed more like a father than a husband, supported him in her arms until the end. Feeling that death was upon him, Mohammed prayed, "O Lord, I beseech thee, assist me in the agonies of death." Then almost in a whisper he repeated 3 times, "Gabriel, come close unto me." In The Hero as Prophet, Thomas Carlyle writes thus of the death of Mohammed. His last words were a prayer, broken ejaculations of a heart struggling up in trembling hope towards its maker. Mohammed was buried under the floor of the apartment in which he died. The present condition of the grave is thus described. Above the hujra is a green dome, surmounted by a large gilt crescent springing from a series of globes. Within the building are the tombs of Mohammed, Abu Bakr, and Umar, with a space reserved for the grave of our Lord Jesus Christ, who Muslims say will again visit the earth and die and be buried at Al-Madinah. The grave of Fatima, the Prophet's daughter, is supposed to be in a separate part of the building, although some say she was buried in Baqi. The Prophet's body is said to be stretched full length on the right side, with the right palm supporting the right cheek, the face fronting Makkah. Close behind him is placed Abu Bakr, whose face fronts Muhammad's shoulder, and then Umar, who occupies the same position with respect to his predecessor. Amongst Christian historians, there is a popular story to the effect that Mohammedans believed the coffin of their prophet to be suspended in the air, which has no foundation whatever in Muslim literature, and Niebuhr thinks the story must have arisen from the rude pictures sold to strangers. Concerning the character of Mohammed, there have been the grossest misconceptions. No evidence exists to support the charges of extreme cruelty and licentiousness laid at his door. On the other hand, the more closely the life of Mohammed is scrutinized by dispassionate investigators, the more apparent become the finer qualities of his nature. In the words of Carlyle, Mahomet himself, after all that can be said about him, was not a sensual man. We so err widely if we consider this man as a common voluptuary, intent mainly on base enjoyments, nay, on enjoyments of any kind. His household was of the frugalist, his common diet barley, bread, and water. Sometimes for months there was not a fire once lighted on his hearth. A poor, hard-working, ill-provided man, careless of what vulgar man toiled for. They called him a prophet, you say? Why, he stood there face to face with them. There, not enshrined in any mystery, visibly clouding his own cloak, cobbling his own shoes, fighting, counseling, ordering in the midst of them, they must have seen what kind of a man he was. Let him be called what you like. No emperor with his tiaras was obeyed as this man in a cloak of his own clouding. Confused by the apparently hopeless task of reconciling the life of the prophet with the absurd statements long accepted as authentic, Washington Irving weighs him in the scales of fairness. His military triumphs awakened no pride nor vainglory, as they would have done had they been effected for selfish purposes. In the time of his greatest power, he maintained the same simplicity of manners and appearances as in the days of his adversity. It is this perfect abnegation of self, connected with this apparent heartfelt piety, running throughout the various phases of his fortune, which perplex one in forming a just estimate of Mahomet's character. When he hung over the deathbed of his infant son Ibrahim, resignation to the will of God was exhibited in his conduct under this keenest of afflictions, and the hope of soon rejoining his child in paradise was his consolation. Aisha, questioned after the death of the prophet concerning his habits, replied that he mended his own clothes, cobbled his own shoes, and helped her in the household duties. How far removed from Western concepts of Mohammed's sanguinary character is Aisha's simple admission that he loved most of all to sew. He also accepted the invitations of slaves and sat at meals with servants, declaring himself to be a servant. Of all vices, he hated lying the most. Before his death, he freed all his slaves. He never permitted his family to use for personal ends any of the alms or tithe money given by his people. He was fond of sweetmeats and used rainwater for drinking purposes. His time he divided into 3 parts, namely, the first he gave to God, the second to his family, and the third to himself. The latter portion, however, he later sacrificed to the service of his people. He dressed chiefly in white, but also wore red, yellow, and green. Mohammed entered Mecca wearing a black turban and bearing a black standard. He wore only the plainest of garments, declaring that rich and conspicuous raiment did not become the pious, and did not remove his shoes at prayer. He was particularly concerned with the cleanliness of his teeth, and at the time of his death, when too weak to speak, indicated his desire for a toothpick. When fearful of forgetting something, the prophet tied a thread to his ring. He once had a very fine gold ring, but noting that his followers had taken to wearing similar rings in emulation of him, he removed his own and threw it away, lest his followers form an evil habit. The most frequent, and apparently the most damaging, accusation brought against Mohammed is that of polygamy. Those who sincerely believe the harem to be irreconcilable with spirituality should with consistency move for the expurgation of the Psalms of David and the Proverbs of Solomon from the list of inspired writings. For the harem of Islam's prophet was insignificant compared with that maintained by Israel's wisest king and the reputed favorite of the Most High. The popular conception that Mohammed taught that woman had no soul and could attain heaven only through marriage is not substantiated by the words and attitude of the prophet during his lifetime. In a paper entitled The Influence of Islam on Social Conditions, read at the World's Parliament of Religions held in Chicago in 1893, Mohammed Webb states the charge and answers it thus. It has been said that Mohammed and the Quran denied a soul to woman and ranked her with the animals. The Quran places her on a perfect and complete equality with man, and the Prophet's teachings often place her in a position superior to the male in some respects. Mr. Webb justifies his stand by quoting from the 35th verse of the 33rd surah of the Quran. Verily the Moslems of either sex, and the true believers of either sex, and the devout men, and the devout women, and the men of veracity, and the women of veracity, and the patient men, and the patient women, and the humble men, and the humble women, and the almsgivers of either sex, and the men who fast, and the women who fast, and the chaste men, and the chaste women, and those of either sex who remember Allah frequently. For them hath Allah prepared forgiveness and a great reward. Here the attainment of heaven is clearly set forth as a problem whose only solution is that of individual merit. On the day of his death, Mohammed told Fatima, his beloved daughter, and Safiya, his aunt, "Work ye out that which shall gain acceptance for you with the Lord, for I verily have no power with him to save you in any wise." The Prophet did not advise either woman to rely upon the virtues of her husband, nor in any manner did he indicate woman's salvation to be dependent upon the human frailty of her spouse. Everything to the contrary notwithstanding, Mohammed is not responsible for the contradictions and inconsistencies in the Quran, for the volume was not compiled and did not assume its present form until over 20 years after his death. In its present state, the Quran is, for the major part, a jumble of hearsay through which occasionally shines forth an example of true inspiration. From what is known of the man Mohammed, it is reasonable to suppose that these nobler and finer portions represent the actual doctrines of the Prophet. The remainder are obvious interpolations, some arising from misunderstanding and others direct forgeries calculated to satisfy the temporal ambitions of conquering Islam. On this subject, Godfrey Higgins speaks with his usual perspicacity. Here we have the Quran of Mohammed and the first four sincere and zealous patriarchs, and the Quran of the conquering and magnificent Saracens, puffed up with pride and vanity. The Quran of the eclectic philosopher was not likely to suit the conquerors of Asia. A new one must be grafted on the old to find a justification for their enormities. To the discerning few, it is evident that Mohammed had a knowledge of that secret doctrine, which must needs constitute the core of every great philosophical, religious, or ethical institution. Through one of four possible avenues, Mohammed may have contacted the ancient mystery teachings: through direct contact with the great school in the invisible world, through the Nestorian Christian monks, through the mysterious holy man who appeared and disappeared at frequent intervals during the period in which the surahs of the Quran were revealed, through a decadent school already existing in Arabia, which school, in spite of its lapse into idolatry, still retained the secrets of the ancient wisdom cult. The arcana of Islam may yet be demonstrated to have been directly founded upon the ancient pagan mysteries performed at the Kaaba centuries before the birth of the Prophet. In fact, it is generally admitted that many of the ceremonials now embodied in the Islamic mysteries are survivals of pagan Arabia. The feminine principle is repeatedly emphasized in Islamic symbolism. For example, Friday, which is sacred to the planet Venus, is the Muslims' holy day. Green is the color of the prophet, and, being symbolic of verdure, is inevitably associated with the World Mother. And both the Islamic crescent and the scimitar may be interpreted to signify the crescent shape of either the moon or Venus. The famous stone of Kaaba, Kabir, or Kebir at Mecca, says Jennings, which is so devoutly kissed by the faithful, is a talisman. It is said that the figure of Venus is seen to this day engraved upon it with a crescent. This very Kaaba itself was at first an idolatrous temple, where the Arabians worshipped Al-Uzza, God, and Isa, that is Venus. The Mussulmans, writes Sir William Jones, are already a sort of heterodox Christians. They are Christians, if Locke reasons justly, because they firmly believe the Immaculate Conception, divine character, and miracles of the Messiah. But they are heterodox in denying vehemently his character of Son and his equality as God with the Father, of whose unity and attributes they entertain and express the most awful ideas. While they consider our doctrine as perfect blasphemy, and insist that our copies of the Scriptures have been corrupted both by Jews and Christians. The following lines are declared by the followers of the prophet to have been deleted from the Christian Gospels. And when Jesus, the Son of Mary, said, O children of Israel, verily I am the apostle of God sent unto you, confirming the law which was delivered before me, and bringing good tidings of an apostle who shall come after me, and whose name shall be Ahmed. In the present text containing the prophecy of Jesus concerning a comforter to come after him, it is further claimed that the word comforter should be translated illustrious, and that it had a direct reference to Mohammed. Also that the tongues of flame that descended upon the apostles on the day of Pentecost in no way could be interpreted as signifying the promised comforter. When asked, however, for definite proof that the original Gospels contained these so-called expurgated references to Mohammed, the Moslems make a counter-demand for production of the original documents upon which Christianity is founded. Until such writings are discovered, the point under dispute must remain a source of controversy. To ignore the heritage of culture received from Islam would be an unpardonable oversight, for when the crescent triumphed over the cross in southern Europe, it was the harbinger of a civilization which had no equal in its day. In Studies in a Mosque, Stanley Lanepool writes, for nearly 8 centuries under her Mohammedan rulers Spain set to all Europe a shining example of a civilized and enlightened state. Art, literature, and science prospered as they then prospered nowhere else in Europe. Students flocked from France and Germany and England to drink from the fountains of learning which flowed only in the cities of the Moors. The surgeons and doctors of Andalusia were in the van of science. Women were encouraged to devote themselves to serious study, and a lady doctor was not unknown among the people of Cordova. Mathematics, astronomy and botany, history, philosophy and jurisprudence were to be mastered in Spain and in Spain alone. The Library of Original Sources thus sums up the effects of Islam. The results of Mohammedism have been greatly underestimated. In the century after Mohammed's death, it wrested Asia Minor, Africa, and Spain from Christianity, more than half of the civilized world, and established a civilization, the highest in the world during the Dark Ages. It brought the Arabian race to their highest development, raised the position of women in the East, though it retained polygamy, was intensively monotheistic, and until the Turks gained control for the most part encouraged progress. In the same work, among the great Islamic scientists and philosophers who have made substantial contributions to human knowledge are listed Geber, or Jafer, who in the 9th century laid the foundations for modern chemistry. Ben Musa, who in the 10th century introduced the theory of algebra. Al-Hayes, who in the 11th century made a profound study of optics and discovered the magnifying power of convex lenses. And in the 11th century also, both Avicenna, or Ibn Sina, whose medical encyclopedia was the standard of his age, and the great Qabbalist Avesbrin, or Ibn Jebirol. Looking back upon the science of the Mohammedans, resumes the authority just quoted, it will be seen that they laid the first foundations of chemistry and made important advances in mathematics and optics. Their discoveries never had the influence they should have had upon the course of European civilization, but this was because Europe itself was not enlightened enough to grasp and make use of them. Geber's observation that oxidized iron weighs heavier than before oxidation had to be made over again. So had some of their work in optics and many of their geographical discoveries. They had rounded Africa long before Vasco da Gama. The composition of gunpowder came into Northern Europe from them. We must never forget that the Dark Ages in Christian Europe were the bright ones of the Mohammedan world. In the field of philosophy, the Arabs started by adopting the Neoplatonism they found in Europe and gradually working back to Aristotle. What means the subtle mystery of the phoenix reborn every 600 years? Faintly from within the sanctuary of the world mysteries is whispered the answer. 600 years before Christ, the phoenix of wisdom, Pythagoras, spread its wings and died upon the altar of humanity, consumed by the sacrificial fire. In Nazareth, the bird was again reborn from its own ashes, only to die upon the tree which had its roots in Adam's skull. In AD 600 appeared Ahmed, Mohammed. Again the phoenix suffered, this time from the poison of Qabar, and from its charred ashes rose to spread its wings across the face of Mongolia, where in the 12th century Genghis Khan established the rule of wisdom. Circling the mighty desert of Gobi, the phoenix again gave up its form, which now lies buried in a glass sarcophagus under a pyramid bearing upon it the ineffable figures of the mysteries. After the lapse of 600 years from the death of Genghis Khan, did Napoleon Bonaparte, who believed himself to be the man of destiny, contact in his wanderings this strange legend of the continual periodic rebirth of wisdom? Did he feel the spreading wings of the phoenix within himself, and did he believe the hope of the world had taken flesh in him? The eagle on his standard may well have been the phoenix. This would explain why he was moved to believe himself predestined to establish the kingdom of Christ on earth, and is, perhaps, the clue to his little understood friendliness toward the Moslem. The North American Indian is by nature a symbolist, a mystic, and a philosopher. Like most Aboriginal peoples, his soul was en rapport with the cosmic agencies manifesting about him. Not only did his Manitos control creation from their exalted seats above the clouds, but they also descended into the world of men and mingled with their red children. The gray clouds hanging over the horizon were the smoke from the calumets of the gods, who could build fires of petrified wood and use a comet for a flame. The American Indian peopled the forests, rivers, and sky with myriads of superphysical and invisible beings. There are legends of entire tribes of Indians who lived in lake bottoms, of races who were never seen in the daytime, but who, coming forth from their hidden caves, roamed the earth at night and waylaid unwary travelers. Also of Bat Indians, with human bodies and bat-like wings, who lived in gloomy forests and inaccessible cliffs, and who slept hanging head downward from great branches and outcroppings of rock. The red man's philosophy of elemental creatures is apparently the outcome of his intimate contact with nature, whose inexplicable wonders become the generating cause of such metaphysical speculations. In common with the early Scandinavians, the Indians of North America considered the Earth, the Great Mother, to be an intermediate plane, bounded above by a heavenly sphere, the dwelling place of the Great Spirit, and below by a dark and terrifying subterranean world, the abode of shadows and of submundane powers. Like the Chaldeans, they divided the interval between the surface of earth and heaven into various strata, one consisting of clouds, another of the paths of the heavenly bodies, and so on. The underworld was similarly divided, and like the Greek system, represented to the initiated the house of the lesser mysteries. Those creatures capable of functioning in two or more elements were considered as messengers between the spirits of these various planes. The abode of the dead was presumed to be in a distant place, in the heavens above, the earth below, the distant corners of the world, or across wide seas. Sometimes a river flows between the world of the dead and that of the living, in this respect paralleling Egyptian, Greek, and Christian theology. To the Indian, the number 4 has a peculiar sanctity, presumably because the Great Spirit created his universe in a square frame. This is suggestive of the veneration accorded the tetrad by the Pythagoreans, who held it to be a fitting symbol of the Creator. The legendary narratives of the strange adventures of intrepid heroes, who while in the physical body penetrated the realms of the dead prove beyond, question the presence of mystery cults among the North American red men. Wherever the mysteries were established, they were recognized as the philosophically equivalents of death, for those passing through the rituals experienced all after-death conditions while still in the physical body. At the consummation of the ritual, the initiate actually gained the ability to pass in and out of his physical body at will. This is the philosophically foundation for the allegories of adventures in the Indian Shadowland or world of ghosts. From coast to coast, writes Hartley Burr Alexander. The sacred calumet is the Indian's altar, and its smoke is the proper offering to heaven. In the notes on the same work is given the following description of the pipe ceremony. The master of ceremonies, again rising to his feet, filled and lighted the pipe of peace from his own fire. Drawing 3 whiffs, one after the other, he blew the first towards the zenith, the second towards the ground, and the third towards the sun. By the first act, he returned thanks to the Great Spirit for the preservation of his life during the past year, and for being permitted to be present at this council. By the second, he returned thanks to his mother, the earth, for her various productions which had ministered to his sustenance. And by the third, he returned thanks to the sun for his never-failing light, ever shining upon all. It was necessary for the Indian to secure the red stone for his calumet from the pipestone quarry, where in some remote past the Great Spirit had come, and after fashioning with his own hands a great pipe, had smoked it toward the 4 corners of creation, and thus instituted this most sacred ceremony. Scores of Indian tribes, some of them traveling thousands of miles, secured the sacred stone from the single quarry, where the mandate of the Great Spirit had decreed that eternal peace should reign. The Indian does not worship the sun. He rather regards this shining orb as an appropriate symbol of the great and good spirit who forever radiates life to his red children. In Indian symbolism, the serpent, especially the great serpent, corroborates other evidence pointing to the presence of the mysteries on the North American continent. The flying serpent is the Atlantean token of the initiate. The 7-headed snake represents the 7 great Atlantean islands, the cities of Cibola, and also the 7 great prehistoric schools of esoteric philosophy. Moreover, who can doubt the presence of the secret doctrine in the Americas when he gazes upon the Great Serpent Mound in Adams County, Ohio, where the huge reptile is represented as disgorging the egg of existence? Many American Indian tribes are reincarnationists, some are transmigrationists. They even called their children by the names supposed to have been born by them in a former life. There is an account of an instance where a parent by inadvertence had given his infant the wrong name, whereupon the babe cried incessantly until the mistake had been rectified. The belief in reincarnation is also prevalent among the Eskimos. Aged Eskimos not infrequently kill themselves in order to reincarnate in the family of some newly married loved one. The American Indians recognize the difference between the ghost and the actual soul of a dead person, a knowledge restricted to initiates of the mysteries. In common with the Platonists, they also understood the principles of an archetypal sphere, wherein exist the patterns of all forms manifesting in the earth plane. The theory of group, or elder, souls having supervision over the animal species, is also shared by them. The red man's belief in guardian spirits would have warmed the heart of Paracelsus. When they attain the importance of being protectors of entire clans or tribes, these guardians are called totems. In some tribes, impressive ceremonies mark the occasion when the young men are sent out into the forest to fast and pray, and there remain until their guardian spirit manifests to them. Whatever creature appears thereupon becomes their peculiar genius, to whom they appeal in time of trouble. The outstanding hero of North American Indian folklore is Hiawatha, a name which, according to Lewis Spence, signifies he who seeks the wampum belt. Hiawatha enjoys the distinction of anticipating by several centuries the late Woodrow Wilson's cherished dream of a League of Nations. Following in the footsteps of Schoolcraft, Longfellow confused the historical Hiawatha of the Iroquois with Manabajo, a mythological hero of the Algonquins and Ojibways. Hiawatha, a chief of the Iroquois, after many reverses and disappointments, succeeded in uniting the 5 great nations of the Iroquois into the League of the 5 Nations. The original purpose of the League, to abolish war by substituting councils of arbitration, was not wholly successful, but the power of the silver chain conferred upon the Iroquois a solidarity attained by no other confederacy of North American Indians. Hiawatha, however, met the same opposition which has confronted every great idealist, irrespective of time or race. The shamans turned their magic against him, and according to one legend, created an evil bird which, swooping down from heaven, tore his only daughter to pieces before his eyes. When Hiawatha, after accomplishing his mission, had sailed away in his self-propelled canoe along the path of the sunset, his people realized the true greatness of their benefactor and elevated him to the dignity of a demigod. In Longfellow's Song of Hiawatha, the poet has cast the great Indian statesman in a charming setting of magic and enchantment. Yet through the maze of symbol and allegory is ever faintly visible the figure of Hiawatha the Initiate, the very personification of the red man and his philosophy.